Last story for now before I have to leave for a bit. This is another one from Frank. And it's a good one. During his time as a commercial diver on the West Coast, Frank made a friend. And with friends like this, who needs enemies? Frank first met his friend while doing a basic maintenance checkup on the local marina. He was checking on the moorings to make sure they were in good condition when he noticed something strange. One of the mooring chains appeared to be sticking straight out of a large rock on the ocean floor. Frank moved in to take a look, and sure enough the chain was somehow embedded in this rock. Perplexed, Frank felt around where the chain entered the rock and noticed something even stranger. The rock felt distinctly unlike a rock. In fact, it felt very softy and squishy, and it was looking at him. The color of the rock suddenly flashed to white and then the entire thing vanished in a cloud of dark ink. You might have guessed it at this point, but Frank's friend is a Pacific giant octopus. They can weigh around 600 pounds and if measured from tentacle to tentacle can grow to over 30 feet in diameter. They also have the ability to change the color of every cell in their body, allowing them to mimic nearly any object on the sea floor. They're big, next to invisible and can be very, very smart. So it was fortunate for Frank that this particular octopus, who he named Frederick, was just a prankster and not a serial killer, like some reports of giant octopus I've heard. Over the next few months, Frank would encounter Frederick on various dives, imitating some strange object, flashing white upon being discovered and swimming away in a cloud of ink. After a while Frank simply assumed that anything strange he saw was just Frederick playing a prank on him and ignore him, which would lead to Frederick tickling the back of his head while he wasn't looking or playing with the valves on his equipment. After being ignored one too many times, Frederick turned off Frank's oxygen regulator briefly before turning it back on. After that, Frank made sure not to ignore him and would occasionally bring toys or things down from the surface for him to play with. This odd relationship continued for most of the year until about January, where Frederick disappeared for several weeks. Frank said that he was relieved, but I think he worried about what had happened to his friend. Frank eventually found him at the same marina he had first seen him, wrapped around the chain and disguised as a rock. His skills of disguise seemed to have gotten dull, as the rock looked distinctly unrock-like and was covered in strange white spots. Frank waved hello, his customary greeting to Frederick, and after a pause, Frederick waved back. He flashed white briefly, then changed back into the color of a rock. Frank hung around for a while, but Frederick didn't seem to be interested in playing hide and seek or any other games, so he went back to his inspection. After a week of half expecting to spot Frederick somewhere on one of his dives, Frank returned to the marina. Frederick was still there, wrapped around the chain. He was no longer disguised as a rock, and his skin was a bright red mottled with white spots. He waved at Frank, flashed white and then turned back red. Frank had brought some fish with him, but Frederick refused to eat or move, staying anchored around the mooring chain. Frank came back the next day with a lobster, which was apparently Frederick's favorite food. He was still there, hugging the mooring chain. He refused to eat the lobster and didn't wave to Frank or flash white like he usually did. The next day, he was gone. Frank came back once a week for the next month before finally giving up on seeing him there again. Sometimes still, Frank will inspect strange rocks or objects he sees underwater, in hopes of seeing Frederick one last time. You can find lots of things at the bottom of the ocean. A friend isn't usually one of them.
That's so crazy. Did Fred die? Or was he dying and then went somewhere to die? Wow. Imagine this being living there, self-aware, wondering why it has this amazing intelligence, observing life, seeing a human being, playing tricks, etc. And then finally, saying, goodbye. I don't know anything about this stuff, but it turning red etc. Sounds like he was dying and losing control over his body. This story is so sad.
Octopus typically die soon after they mate. The females remain alive long enough for them to guard the eggs, but males develop a form of dementia and stop eating right after mating is over. Their body basically self-destructs and consumes itself for energy until death occurs. Giant Pacific octopuses are semmelporous. They breed once before death. After reproduction, they enter a stage called senescence, which involves obvious changes in behavior and appearance, including a reduced appetite, retraction of skin around the eyes giving them a more pronounced appearance, increased activity in uncoordinated patterns, and white lesions all over the body. While the duration of this stage is variable, it typically lasts about 1 to 2 months. Death is typically attributed to starvation, as the females stop hunting and instead protect their eggs. Males often spend more time in the open, making them more likely to be preyed upon. Fred became a dad.
Have sex. Die. Would you anons do it?
This story is also one of my own. It happened in Hawaii during one of my many diving vacations. It's a damn beautiful place with great weather and even greater views underwater. While I can appreciate the dark, murky atmosphere at the bottom of a lake, there's definitely something enchanting about crystal clear water filled with colorful exotic fish. It's certainly much less frightening than any of my deep-sea dives, especially the ones that involved me welding vital components for hours on end with even the smallest mistake having potentially devastating consequences. That, however, does not mean that it was not dangerous. You are always in danger underwater, whether you realize it or not. It is not your how. You don't live there. You don't belong there. And most importantly, in the water, you are no longer the world's apex predator. You are in a much, much bigger pond. Keep that in mind if you ever go diving yourself. It might just save your life. Even a small thing could kill you. In this case, it was a moray eel. Now morays are known for being vicious, but most people don't know that they're also very intelligent. I like to call them sea demons due to their disturbing combination of cold intellect and raw aggression. If one bites you, the best way to get it to let go is to cave its skull in. Otherwise, good luck getting it to let go. That in itself isn't unusual, but when it's paired with an uncanny intellect it gets a little bit scary. This moray in particular was the king demon of all the sea demons. Not in size. He was about average for an older moray. What placed him above all the others was his pure dickishness. He tried to fucking cut my oxygen lines. I felt something tug at them violently, and I spun around to be face and face with this fucking dickhead. I could just see how fucking smug he was. That stupid fucking face. He knew what he was doing. And I knew that he knew. And he knew that I knew. So I pull out my knife that I keep for defense against sharks and cutting myself free if I ever get loose, and I show it to him. See? Look. It's shiny. If I poke you with it, you die. He knew what that was too. He didn't seem worried, but he backed off a bit. I kept an eye on him the whole way back to shore. I swear the cunt performed the moray equivalent of flipping me off when he finally swam away as I was nearing the shore. Moral of the story? Morays are cunts. Don't fuck with them. The next story is another one from Frank, who seems to have simultaneously the best and worst luck when it comes to sea life. I saw a great white shark come out of nowhere behind him once, only for it to simply bump him with its nose and move on without harming him or anyone else. The danger in this story, though, comes from a very different sort of creature. If you've read of my other stories, you probably know that Frank is a tiny bit reckless, likes to dive alone in remote locations, often at night. This time he was doing a cave dive, at night, by himself, which is pretty much the diver's entire list of do not do this if you want to live. So it's no surprise that he got himself into a bit of a dangerous situation, He was a bit sparse on the details. But the trouble started sometime after he entered the cave. The initial passage was wide, but narrowed significantly before opening up into a number of larger passages. Frank had left the initial entry and was pulling himself through the narrowest part of the passage. That was when he felt something bump up against his leg. Immediately, he froze. Something or someone was directly behind him in the narrow passage. It was too narrow for him to look behind himself, let alone turn himself around. So he gritted his teeth and slowly inched himself backwards through the passage. After a few moments had passed without encountering anything, he began to think that it had been some curious fish or his imagination. For a second, he thought it might be Frederick playing a prank on him. That's when the creature slammed into the back of his knee at high speed. The force of the impact threw Frank forward, bouncing him between the narrow passage walls. His first instinct was to get out of the narrow part of the cave so that he could defend himself, but the blow had done significant damage and pain shot up his leg when he tried bending the knee that had been struck. Kicking with his uninjured leg and pulling against the walls of the passage with his hands, Frank desperately pushed on through the widening passage. Before he could reach an area wide enough to turn around, another blow from the creature struck the back of his other knee. Pain shot up his leg, and as he tried to keep going, something grabbed the back of his flipper and yanked back on it, sending another searing jolt of pain from the knee up his leg. On the verge of panic now, Frank desperately pulled himself forward through the passage, where it finally mercifully widened enough to turn. He whirled around to face his attacker, and found himself staring at the long, fleshy snout and beady eyes of an Amazonian river dolphin. The creature stared at him from a few feet beyond his reach in the narrow passage, partially obscured by the blood now beginning to cloud the water. Frank's first thought was, "You shouldn't be here," which is true, as the name would seem to indicate. Amazonian river dolphins live in rivers, not caves. Not to mention that this was a saltwater cave accessed from the ocean, and this species of dolphin was freshwater. Frank was in the right part of the world to meet one of these dolphins, but the one in this cave was extremely out of place. Of course, whether something should or shouldn't be somewhere didn't change the fact that there was a very large, very intelligent animal that seemed to want him dead, blocking his exit from the cave. The dolphin stayed nearly perfectly still as Frank stared him down into a pair of dead, beady eyes. Slowly, Frank reached back to the leg holster for his knife only to find it empty. The dolphin didn't blink or move, but Frank said he saw an imperceptible change in the thing's eyes. It didn't vocalize or even move an inch, but Frank knew from what he saw in those eyes that it was trying to kill him. Not because it was going to eat him. Not because he was in its territory or any other reason animals usually kill. It was going to kill him because it wanted to. Because it liked it. Frank has always said that he's never seen a true sea monster. That thing in the cave, though, he told me, that was a sea monster. The standoff lasted for a few more minutes before Frank decided it was in his best interest to move further down the cave. Slowly he backed himself down the widening passage, keeping his eyes locked with the killer that shadowed his movements from a distance. The entire time the thing never vocalized, never made a sound, which scared Frank almost as much as the attack itself. Dolphins wear their emotions on their sleeve, he said to me. They are very expressive creatures, and I've never seen one be this quiet, before or since. Frank continued backing down the passage, glancing back over his shoulder to see how close he was to the main chamber. Without warning, the dolphin struck, but Frank had been expecting that. He whirled back around, hands out in front of his face. The creature hadn't had enough space to build up a lot of speed, and Frank was able to push the blow aimed at his mask to the side with his forearms before grabbing the thing's snout and slamming it into the cave well several times. It thrashed and spun, knocking Frank's grip loose. It backed up a few feet and kept its distance as Frank considered his options. He couldn't stay put forever. and the chance of help arriving was slim to none. If he tried to leave the cave, the dolphin would probably just push him back. There was no exit further down the cave as far as Frank knew. Several sections were unexplored, but he didn't want to bet his chances on finding an exit while being chased by a killer dolphin. That seemed like the only option though. So Frank began to back up further through the passage. His attacker followed him again, albeit at a further distance than before. Right as Frank reached the part where the passage opened up fully, he slowed to a stop with one hand resting on the cave wall. In a flash of movement, the dolphin streaked forward through the water toward Frank. He had only one chance to get this right. Now, that thing was smart, and he knew it, Frank said to me, sipping at his bourbon, but he didn't know that I knew it. And what else he didn't know? I was smarter. Frank had guessed that the dolphin's goal was to get past him the large section of the cave, where Frank would be unable to properly defend himself in the larger open space with his injured legs, and if he tried to get out the cave through the passage it would either drag him back in or kill him in the open water outside. Frank had only one chance to get it right. As the dolphin burst past him, he slammed one hand into its stomach while grabbing the head and snout with the other. With its momentum briefly halted, he pulled it tightly into a bear hug. That's when he shoved the rock that he'd picked up from the cave floor earlier directly into the creature's blowhole. I could tell that it was shocked. Sort of. It didn't know quite what had happened at first, Frank mused to himself, staring into his glass. And it couldn't hear me well, let alone understand me. But I said to myself, time's on my side now, you son of a bitch. He knew it too, and scurried off down the tunnel in a flash. I could see him, trying to get that rock loose. There was a few bubbles I saw, but I'm fairly certain it was stuck in there real good. Frank chuckled, drinking the rest of his bourbon. And when I finally got out the cave up back to the surface, slowly, mind you on account of being unable to use my legs, that's when I saw him again in the moonlight. He was gasping for air, all pathetic like, couldn't get enough past that rock to breathe proper, and couldn't dislodge it neither. I looked him straight in the eye, and then I swam away. I'd imagine he perished shortly after, the murderous son of a bitch.